Hi, this is Jeff Ryan. Welcome to another edition of Tales from the Cabin, my weekly podcast and video series. Today I have a great story. As you probably are aware by now, I love a great adventure story. This one's a different kind of adventure story. This one is a conservation adventure story and a comeback story, really. This one is about how a person who was a household name 100 years ago made a great impact on the literary world, made less of an impact than she would have liked on the natural world, at least to begin with, but it ended up coming full circle, and she made quite a contribution which endures to this day. So let's get right into it. In 1863, a woman named Jean Stratton was born in Indiana. She was born and raised there in farm country, but she was also surrounded by an enormous wetland, which was known as Limberlost. It was named Limberlost after a hunter locally known as Limber Jim, who got literally lost in the weeds. This marsh was so extensive, it was 13,000 acres at the time in its natural state. And because he got lost in the swamp and was basically found again, it became known as Limberlost Swamp. Jean Stratton was very enamored of the natural world, spent a lot of time in the neighborhood of the marsh, got to know a lot of the bird life there, a lot of the insects, and ultimately she became a writer. And as an adult, she started writing novels, and she became so well known that in fact between 1912 and 1945, of the 55 books that sold over 1 million copies, she had written 5 of them. Her books spoke a lot about the need to appreciate the creatures of the swamp and also the need to protect the wetlands, which was quite prescient for someone who was writing in the early 1900s. As I mentioned before, her books became so popular that ultimately the screenplays for her books led her to Hollywood, where she enjoyed a second career working with the producers of her films. But the first 2 films did not come out the way she would like. She wanted them to be more faithful to her books. And because that wasn't happening, she took the money that she was earning from writing and plowed it into starting her own movie studio. She was one of the first women owners of a movie studio. And with the money that she made in Hollywood, she ended up buying some property adjacent to what used to be the swamp. The problem was that when she was in Hollywood, a lot of the swamp was being destroyed. In the 19-teens, there was a big push for lumber to be extracted, for oil to be drilled, and for marshland to be turned into farmland. So these giant steam-powered dredge machines came through the area and eventually cut a big trough all the way through the swamp and drained it. Most of Limberlost Swamp was lost, was dried to the extent that they could. As I mentioned, there were big gullies, troughs cut into the swampland. There were also a series of stone tiles put into the bottom of these dredged troughs. Those tiles helped make sure that the water continued to run down and percolate out into the Wabash River. And that worked for several decades. So everything got drained. And in fact, in one of the books that Stratton wrote in 1912, she had this quote: In its day, the swamp covered a large area. Now the Limberlost exists only in ragged spots and patches. Canadian lumbermen came seeking tall, straight timber for ship masts and tough, heavy trees for beams. Then a ditch was dredged across the north end through my best territory, and that carried the water to the Wabash River until oilmen could enter the swamp. So, as I mentioned, it was kind of the triple whammy came down and wiped out a great portion of the swamp. Jean Stratton-Porter, as she became known, her married name, she hyphenated and adopted the last name Porter, would frequently visit her Indiana home territory and actually bought land in two places that is now part of the Indiana State Preserve System, to be in proximity to the marsh that she knew and loved as a child. Jean Stratton-Porter died in 1924. She died in a car accident. She was in her 60s. She was being driven by her chauffeur to a place in Hollywood, and they were hit by a streetcar and she died. So after the 1920s, her books and columns continued to appear for a while. She was very active in writing newspaper columns and serialized stories for magazines, and that kept going for about 5 years after she died. But her star dimmed a little bit. I wouldn't say it faded entirely, but it dimmed. And fast forward to the late 1940s, early 1950s, when a young boy named Ken Brunswick was raised in Western Ohio. Ken Brunswick would remember an appreciation for the outdoors from a very, very young age, and his father would read to him stories under the big tree out in front of the farmhouse. I think we can all picture those single giant tree out in front of a classic Midwestern farmyard. And he had really strong memories of his dad reading him books about wildlife, birds, and insects in particular, but also wildlife in general. And so Ken Brunswick grew up and knew that he was going to sort of grab the baton and also become a dairy farmer like his dad was, but had a young family of his own and needed to go find some farmland. And so he and his wife went looking for farmland, and they ended up going into eastern Indiana to look for some, and they found what they felt to be the perfect place. And they bought it. And it was this lovely eastern Indiana farm right outside the small town of Bryant, Indiana. And he started with his family working the farm. And there was this corner of the farm that was always wet. In particular in the spring, it was flooded in the corner. And it had had a tile system in it to help drain it, but that was all plugged up. And he started talking to his neighbors about it. And they said, yeah, portions of their field, obviously in the same area, were swamped every spring. In springs with really epic rainfalls, their crops would be decimated in those portions of their field. Well, Ken Brunswick started getting really interested in this tile system that was on his farm. So it didn't take him long to realize that this whole system led him to Jean Stratton-Porter and her books about Limberlost, and realized that his farm and his neighbors' farms were all part of the Limberlost swamp ecosystem. And Ken was very inspired to learn everything he could about that watershed and do what he could to start rehabbing it, rehabilitating it. And this included not only getting his fellow farmers into the act in terms of getting them interested in restoring that part of the marshland. But Ken also ended up even going back to school to get a degree in watershed management. And he got his degree and he launched a nonprofit to start doing what he and others could do to start rehabilitating this marsh. And fast forward even further to this day, and it's really remarkable what Ken Brunswick and his nonprofit, Friends of Limberlost, have been able to do. They have, in their own little marshland, has expanded to become 485 acres now, which they've reintroduced prairie grasses that were not thriving there for obvious reasons. They've plugged up the sections that used to be drained out. That was job number one. They've replanted lowland hardwoods, which had been wiped out through lumbering. And they've step by step restored this marsh. They've also gotten other people to contribute, including the state. And now the Limberlost marsh, which at one point was 13,000 acres, is back to nearly 1,300 acres, which is really an amazing accomplishment. And sure, it's not back to 13,000, but what successes they've seen so far have been truly inspiring. First of all, birds that haven't been seen in 40 years are now being spotted because the flyway is reestablishing itself. That's really exciting. The prairie grass is taking. There are nature paths leading through, educating people about the history of the marsh. It's a wonderful place. And as you may imagine from the footage that I've shown, if you're watching on YouTube, I went out there. I was so inspired myself to see what this was all about that I went out to the Loblolly Marsh, which is the section that Ken Brunswick and his organization were able to reestablish. And it is quite something. So hats off to Ken Brunswick, to Jean Stratton-Porter, who never was able to halt, quote unquote, progress, but was able to make her own mark generations later, thanks to the work that she did. And oh, by the way, those stories that Ken Brunswick's father, if you haven't figured it out, the ones that he was reading to his son under that tree in the front yard, those were written by Jean Stratton-Porter. So if you ever find yourself going through East Central Indiana, check out the Loblolly Marsh and the other pieces of the marsh that have been protected by Ken's nonprofit, the state of Indiana, and by Jean Stratton-Porter's family, who were able to make sure that those properties got into state hands. It's wonderful. They have a museum for her work, and also check out her work. She was incredibly prolific. It's just an amazing story, and I'm glad to share it with you this week. If you enjoy what I'm doing here on Tales from the Cabin, please consider subscribing to my podcast if that's where you're hearing me, or please subscribe to my videos on YouTube. You can also support my work by going to my website, jeffryanauthor.com, or you can buy me a cup of coffee at buymeacoffee.com/JeffreyRyan. You can give a $5 donation once, or you can do it on a regular basis. It all helps fund my storytelling, my trips to Loblolly Marsh and other places, and keeps this channel alive. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week on Tales from the Cabin.